Could it be more than just an Olympic truce? Not only is the sister of Kim Jong-Un expected to lunch on Friday on the sidelines of the opening ceremonies of the Winter Games, she and North Korea's ceremonial president have been invited by South Korea's President Moon Jae-In. The sudden thaw comes after a steady ratcheting of tensions over the DPRK's nuclear program. So, can a dose of K-pop from the north at the opening ceremony and a unified women's ice hockey team achieve? How big a political gamble is South Korea's president taking? But with nationalist critics accusing him of turning the Pyeongchang Games into the Pyongyang Games. What does Moon make of the North Koreans? Earlier in the day, moving up a military parade normally scheduled for April. What happens after the Olympic flame goes out in 2 weeks' time? We're going to be talking sports and politics. What with a hawkish-sounding U.S. Vice President also on hand for Friday's opening ceremony, Mike Pence, who won't be shaking hands, by the way, with Kim's sister. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at what could be the beginnings of an Olympic thaw. And with us, France 24's Yenna Lee, who's been following it all. Thanks for being with us. Hi. From Washington, South Korean attorney and commentator Nathan Park. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And Harry Kazianis, Director of Defense Studies at the Center for the National Interest. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me again.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, the hashtag F24debate. Did someone say intercontinental missile? Dateline Pyongyang. While South Korea gets set to host its second Olympics after the 1988 Summer Games, the North moving up by 2 months, the military parade to mark the 70th anniversary of the founding of its armed forces.
As long as imperialism remains on the earth and the anti-North Korea policy of the United States continues, the mission of our military, which is to protect our country and people and secure peace, can never change.
Nathan Park, what do you make of that parade?
You know, that parade, it obviously is not helpful towards a peace gesture, but many commentators have noticed that the parade actually was relatively understated. The foreign press was not invited. If North Korea wanted to make a bigger show out of its belligerence and militarism, it would have invited the foreign press and it would have made a bigger international spectacle. So I think that parade, obviously it's not helpful, but it is more geared towards strengthening the domestic control over Kim Jong-un's regime.
So this is for domestic consumption?
I would think that's the case, primarily so.
Harry Kazianis, do you agree?
I do agree largely with Nathan said. I think one of the things we have to keep in mind is one of North Korea's goals, which is part of their playbook really for decades now, is to divide Seoul and Washington. And I think for a lot of respects, yes, this parade is certainly aimed at domestic audiences. It's important for the North Korean people to realize why a lot of them are starving, and that's the success of their nuclear program. But this parade is very much aimed at Washington. We have Mike Pence, who's going to be at the opening ceremonies with Otto Warmbier's father. And, there could be some potential stare downs between him and, North Korean athletes and maybe Kim Jong-un's sister. But this parade, I think, was very much geared towards Washington to show, us here, 2 blocks from the White House, that North Korea does have the capability to reach out and hit us with atomic weapons. So I think that was a big part of why they did this parade and why it, will probably ratchet up tensions a little bit more.
All right, so Nathan, who thinks it's geared towards the North Koreans, Harry, who thinks it's geared towards Washington, south of the DMZ. Of course, it's the final countdown to South Korea's first Olympics in 30 years. The political stakes are indeed high. Charles Pellegrin has more.
Can sports diplomacy ease tensions on the Korean peninsula? Seoul wants its Winter Olympics to be a harbinger of peace. For some South Koreans, however, the participation of North Korea is stirring up conflict.
This is a joke. How can we talk of peace while North Korea is preparing its missiles and nuclear weapons?
These Olympic Games are becoming North Korea's games. I don't like that. I'm proud of my flag. I don't want to see a North Korean flag.
The North's colors are flying over Pyeongchang, especially in the Olympic Village. Pyongyang has made headlines around the world in the past few months with its repeated ballistic missile tests and its nuclear program. And the trading of insults and threats between Kim Jong-Un and Donald Trump have added fuel to the fire. In a surprise move at the start of the year, Pyongyang de-escalated the situation by sending a delegation to Seoul. And even the United States aren't opposed to a meeting with the Kim Jong-un regime.
President Trump has said he always believes in talking. But I haven't requested any meeting, but we'll see what happens.
Washington remains cautious. North Korea cannot use these games as a public relations stunt to hide the realities of its dictatorship. Pyongyang will have 22 athletes competing in 5 sports. And as a peace offering, the two Koreas will have a joint women's ice hockey team playing under the flag of a unified Korea.
Yana Lee, that unified ice hockey team, it's a divisive issue right now in South Korea.
It is a very divisive issue. There's been a survey that was done by the South Korea's National Assembly Speaker and a very big TV channel as well, SBS, and it said that 70% of South Koreans oppose the formation of this joint team between North Korea and South Korean players.
Yeah, did President Moon perhaps underestimate popular sentiment on this?
I think he did because, in fact, he had to apologize afterwards. He said that he was sorry that he didn't ask the players' opinion first.
Some had to get kicked off the team to make room for the North Koreans.
Pretty much. I mean, they've been added to the roster, so technically no one's been kicked off the team per se, but that means the South Korean players will have less time on ice, and it had a massive backlash amongst young Koreans online and in real life in petitions.
It's going to be fascinating to see what kind of chemistry can there be between these North Korean and South Korean athletes on that team.
Well, adding, from a sporting point of view, adding players last minute is always a bit tricky. I know that the team's coach, she's an American coach, she said it was all a bit last minute and she was scared that the chemistry wouldn't be right. There's also been articles about how they have trouble, even though they speak the same language, they've got different vocabulary when it comes to hockey, because South Koreans have been using a lot of American terms, which obviously North Korean players don't use. They have very Korean terms for every word. So they've had to, make up for this lost time through this game practices.
Nathan Park, will you be rooting for the South Koreans women's team?
Oh, you mean the joint Korean women's
sorry,
team?
The joint Korean, exactly, yeah.
Yeah, but I would be rooting for them. It's a historical occasion, but the fact that South Korean public is opposed to them it should be taken seriously. It is a very important moment where it's been this year is essentially about 70-year mark of the division of the two Koreas, and approximately 65-year mark of the end of the Korean War. And South Korean public is starting to drift off from North Korea. The first joint team happened in 1991 in ping pong. And if you look at South Korean newspapers from that time, the reaction was 100% unreservedly ecstatic. And even conservatives, liberals across the board welcomed the development. And nearly 30 years later, now the situation has turned quite significantly. So now I think it's really important for North Korea to consider this moment very carefully, because this is a moment where it may really be the final moment before the South Korean public completely detaches itself from North Korea and abandons reunification as any kind of hope. And this really may be the last peace offering that the South Korean public is willing to give. Yeah,
the two Koreas officially still at war. The final status of the peninsula up in the air since 1953. Support for reunification in the South has waned, as Nathan was saying, with more than 60% of 20-somethings in this Pew Research Center survey from last year opposing a single Korea. Yana Lee, what's your reaction when you look at these figures?
Well, you can see that the younger you are, the less likely you are to be for reunification. It's not that surprising, actually, when you think about how people of my age, my generation, and even our parents, we haven't ever known in our lifetime a unified Korea. The concept is so alien to us.
But you've lived through the tension of potential military conflict all these years. There's that constant tension. So shouldn't you be on edge as much as the older generation?
I think it doesn't necessarily mean people aren't on edge, although I do believe that when you're living with a constant threat, it becomes less scary. You get used to it. You just live with it. At the same time, I mean, the numbers say it all. The younger you are, the less the memory just fades away. We hear stories from our grandparents. We hear stories, but it's less tangible.
So why did South Koreans vote for Moon Jae-in, who's more dovish than his nationalist predecessor?
Yes, I think people have hope. You could want peace. You could want a peaceful peninsula, but it doesn't necessarily mean reunification. And even the term reunification, there are different stages. An old-fashioned, maybe more conservative view would be one country taking over the other in a militaristic, in a war, basically. But now there are lots of people, including Moon Jae-in and his democratic predecessors, who are far more pro-peaceful, slow reunification, which means the opening up of North Korea, a la like Vietnam or China even.
Yeah, Harry Kazianis, the opening up of North Korea. They say capitalism is the great equalizer. If you just trade more, all these problems could go away.
I mean, to a certain extent, but we have to remember, I think there's something like 10 United Nations Security Council resolutions. So the prospect of, some sort of open trade with North Korea, at least to the short or medium term, unless the North Koreans gave up their nuclear weapons or their missiles, I don't see happening. Well, one point I want to make, I think that's really, I think would illuminate this discussion, is I think we have to really talk about what happens after the Olympics, because I think that's really the big problem in all of this. Speaking at least from the American perspective here in Washington, Americans are going to watch these opening ceremonies. You're going to feel a lot of hope and optimism that, hopefully things will get better between the North and the South. But I think a lot of experts here in Washington are really expecting tensions to really blow up in the springtime. There's already reports that the North Koreans are demanding some loosening of sanctions if talks between the North and South are going to go forward. And what North Korea specifically wants is the cancellation of U.S. ROK joint military exercises in April. If that does not happen, I guarantee you that the North Koreans will once again continue to test missiles, and they will test nuclear weapons again. So I've told many colleagues, enjoy the Winter Games while they last, because there's a very good possibility that we will be back on the brink come April.
Yeah, Nathan Park, after the Seoul Olympics in 1988, after the 2002 World Cup that was co-hosted by South Korea, hopes of some kind of détente were dashed.
That's an entirely fair statement. I would even add that in addition to the April hump, there's another hump coming in September. The September 9th is a major holiday in North Korea, and that's usually the time period when North Korea likes to test its missiles. So it is going to be a significant challenge, and there will be, and the Olympics, the hope is that the Olympics will lead to a discussion that will avoid that kind of hump. I do agree that the progress in the Olympics now is merely temporary, and it will not become permanent unless there is going to be a significant progress in the post-Olympics talks. And to the extent that all this stuff about joint Olympics team and marching under the same flag, it is all helpful, but what will happen after the Olympics will be the crucial turning point.
So what can President Moon do, starting with that lunch, obviously, on Friday?
It will be an excellent opportunity, and this is something that is truly meaningful. Where marching under the same flag, all this stuff is a nice memory from one moment, but opening up this kind of channel of communication with the North Korean leadership is a significant moment. Recall that Kim Jong-Un has never really sent his direct family member abroad since he took over the North Korean regimes, and this really does mark a pretty significant moment where Kim's sister will be talking to the South Korean leadership directly and potentially talking to the U.S. leadership directly, and just being able to communicate directly with no with fewer intermediaries would be an important step towards peace.
Yeah. What do we know about Kim's sister?
We know that she is significantly involved. She's 30 years old. It is North Korea being the country that it is, having the Kim Il-sung heritage, the so-called the Baekdu heritage, named after the mountain considered sacred in Korean culture. That alone is a fairly significant point. And we do know that Kim Yo-jong, Kim Jong-un's sister, is pretty strongly involved in managing Kim Jong-un's day-to-day life, especially considering that Kim Jong-un is himself very young. Kim Yo-jong is even younger, but Kim Jong-un himself is very young and requires a great deal of sort of solidarity within his family. So you recall also that Kim Jong-un assassinated his older half-brother, who could potentially pose a threat to his rule. So having his sister on his side is a very important thing for him, and being able to communicate with her will be an important opportunity.
Kim Yo-jong, the sister, is she a known figure in South Korea? Do people know the whole workings or the?
Well,
I don't know what the equivalent is of Kremlinology for watching what goes on inside the high halls of power in Pyongyang.
Well, as Nathan mentioned, she is part of the infamous Baekdu bloodline. I think the hashtag even trended a little bit when we found out news in South Korean media that Kim Yo-jong is going to go to the Olympic Games. She's a highly influential figure, and South Korean people know this. They've been watching this, and they know she's a close aide to the leader, Kim Jong-un. She's not just his little sister. She's apparently got the ear of her brother and can be very influential when it comes to policy making.
Can be influential when it comes to policy making. Harry Kazianis, are you rooting for an encounter between her and Mike Pence?
Yes, I am. I mean, I think the challenge here is the Trump administration's a little bit of a box. They've over the last few months, they've taken on a pretty hard line. They've taken on a perspective that really focuses on human rights. Just a few weeks ago at the State of the Union, you had a North Korean defector defiantly raise his crutches after years ago having a leg and arm amputated in most gruesome way you can think of. So they've essentially sort of shifted the narrative from worrying about military options, fire and fury, to really trying to counter the North Koreans' really propaganda offensive at the Olympics with their own sort of countering human rights narrative, which makes a lot of sense. So how would Mike Pence interact if there's sort of like a brush by? There was a report actually today in the Washington Post that the South Koreans were trying to push Pence in that direction. So
yeah, did he on that score, did he talk himself into a corner on his previous leg of his trip in Tokyo when he talked about increasing sanctions?
I think a little bit, but this is the Trump administration, keep in mind. So, one day they could be talking about, fire and fury, and then the next day they could be potentially talking to Kim. I mean, the Trump administration, I think, is sort of pragmatic when it comes to these things. And I also think that you have different parts of the administration. You have Tillerson and Mattis on one hand that are very much for diplomacy. And I think you have another section led by McMaster and Pence that are for a much harder line. So I would argue that the actual U.S. policy is pretty much in flux. So kind of like Trump says, we'll have to see what happens.
All right, we're going to pick up after a quick break on that point and look at the other divisions facing the two Koreas. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate.
Tech 24, presented by Julia Seeger and Danonjay Kadilke.
New technology, the latest innovation and its impact on a digital society.
Tech 24 on France 24 and France24.com.
France 24, c'est l'info mondiale, partout, toujours à portée de clic.
We look at how technology is shaping the future, and we show you the latest gadgets you can soon get your hands on.
نقدم لكم الاقتصاد بطريقة مختلفة، نبسط المفاهيم والمصطلحات كي تكتمل الصورة لديكم.
At France 24, we love a good argument.
La différence sur France 24, c'est l'idée du reportage. Nos grands reportages, vous ne les verrez nulle part ailleurs.
We are journalists, and normally you have to listen to us, but you have things to tell us too. Maybe you've experienced a dramatic event, or you've got something important to say. You want to make a difference. That is why we created The Observers. Now, the first step is very easy. You get in touch with our team. Send us your images, tell us what you've seen. And then it's our job to get your voice out there on our site, on social networks, on your mobiles and tablets, and on TV, of course. You can appear in our weekly show via webcam. Or perhaps we'll come see you in person, where you live, in your country, your town, and we'll work together on a report for our investigative show, The Observers Direct. So you get the idea. This show is your show, your way to get your voice out to the world.
Welcome back. Before we resume the France 24 debate, some of the stories Laura Cellier is watching for you in the newsroom. The Pentagon says it's not looking for conflict with the Syrian regime. This after airstrikes that killed more than 100 pro-Assad forces were closing in on Kurdish-led militias and their coalition advisors in the eastern Deir el-Zor region Thursday. A U.S. envoy assures Lebanon that Israel doesn't seek an escalation, this over the building of a border wall, and tense indirect negotiations over borders for offshore gas fields between Lebanon and Israel. Closing arguments in the first trial for the sole surviving Paris attacker. The lawyer for Saleh Abdeslam argues for acquittal because of a language mix-up in the Brussels court that's trying him for shooting at police as they closed in on him in March of 2016. And in a week that's seen Elon Musk launch into space one of his own Tesla Roadsters, now comes news of big losses at the electric car maker. Kate Moody will have all the day's business news. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, counting down the hours to the opening ceremonies of the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics, the first hosted by South Korea. And it's a chance during those opening ceremonies to see North Korean athletes. There'll be a unified delegation in the stadium. There'll also be a unified women's ice hockey team. With us to talk about it, France 24's Yena Lee, from Washington, South Korean attorney and commentator Nathan Park, and Harry Kazianis, Director of Defense Studies at the Center for the National Interest. Welcome back to all of you. That unified women's ice hockey team dividing public opinion. Correspondent Clovis Kazali caught up with one North Korean defector who takes a dim view to the gesture by Seoul.
Only a few hundred meters away on the other side of this frozen river lies North Korea, with a memorial in honor of the regime's founding father Kim Il-sung. This woman fled the country 5 years ago by crossing into China. Kim Dan-goom defected with her son, leaving relatives behind.
I miss my two younger sisters and my family who still live there in North Korea. I miss them every day. It's heartbreaking every time I look over there because I know that the North Koreans still don't have freedom. They can't live decently like I do here in South Korea.
Back in Pyongyang, she was in the army with up to 500 men under her command. Today she works part-time for an insurance company, as well as at the DMZ, where she tells her story to tourists. Some of them will be heading to Pyeongchang for the Olympics, where they might get to see North Korean athletes. Kim says the communist regime uses sport as a diplomatic weapon.
In North Korea, athletes come just after soldiers. They're treated far better than regular people. They're pushed hard to win, so they can project a good image of the country. The training standards are also very high, and the government has high expectations from their sports stars.
This border between North and South Korea is the most militarized in the world. From here you can clearly see on the other side communist buildings, a tense environment only 80 kilometers away from Pyeongchang and what organizers have called the Peace Games.
Travis Kazadi reporting from the 38th parallel, the demilitarized zone, the DMZ. Yenna Lee, when you see those images of the DMZ, what springs to mind?
Well, it's supposed to be, and it is, one of the most dangerous places in the world, but it's also a place where that's the end of the war. That sort of marked the end of the war. They stopped there, and it's quite, for a lot of South Koreans, I think it's quite sad to have this zone full of mines that separates the two Koreas.
Well, I'm old enough to have visited East Berlin back when there was the Berlin Wall, and at the time what struck me is that it's absurd, isn't it, to a certain degree, what's going on?
Yeah, it's absurd, but it's the same Cold War politics that has spread out onto smaller pawn countries, and South and North Korea got mixed up in a bigger thing.
Now, there was a happy ending for Berlin, but Nathan Park, I'm haunted by what you said in part one of our discussion about how, with the younger generation, less and less interested in reunification, that DMZ, well, it could be something permanent.
Yes, indeed. My take, whenever I visit DMZ, the first thing I always think of is just how close it is, just distance-wise, that you can clearly see North Korea. It's not very far. The folks living on the other side don't seem all that different from South Koreans. But for younger South Koreans, my generation and younger, have basically grown up in an entirely different world. If you were born in the early 1980s and you're now in the mid to late 30s, you were born into a time when South Korea already was a major world power. Seoul was a global metropolis. And you were also born into a time when North Korea was going through this man-made famine on a disastrous proportion that killed anywhere between several hundred thousands to several million people in a famine that was entirely preventable. So you're younger, you have no memory of a unified Korea ever, and when you think about the idea of living with North Koreans who grew up in that terrible environment, you start thinking, how is this, is this going to be a burden on me? Am I going to have to be the one basically feeding these destitute North Koreans? And that really starts, that makes the calculus really different for younger South Koreans.
Makes the calculus really different. Harry Kazianis, an important point, of course, is that over the years, South Korea has, as Nathan was saying, become no longer an emerging world power, but a developed world power. As a result, should the U.S., we've seen trade tensions between the Trump administration and Seoul, should the U.S. be viewing South Korea differently?
I don't think so. I mean, South Korea has certainly blossomed into not only a very powerful country. They have one of the most powerful navies in Asia. They have a $1 trillion plus economy. Have brands like Samsung and LG that many Americans love, including myself. But I don't think they should be treated differently. I think what the Trump administration really needs to do is double down on this alliance. I don't think it was very helpful slapping Samsung and others with tariffs. I think that sends the wrong message, and it allows North Korea to exploit potential openings. So I think the thing the Trump administration needs to do is find every possible way to eliminate any tensions between Seoul and Washington. I think that's the smartest strategy that we can enable. Plus, I really think that we need to figure out ways to tighten up the military alliance. Seoul took on a lot of risks by accepting the THAAD missile defense system. The Chinese were very upset and slapped Seoul with all different types of penalties. They went to great risks to do that. So I think one of the things the Trump administration needs to do is double down on this alliance. I think it's really the smartest strategy.
Is it possible, Yenna Lee, to double down on that alliance when you have a president who's been elected by citizens who oppose that missile defense program, that THAAD missile defense program?
It's a super fine balance for President Moon Jae-in to deal with because, as you said, there's a lot of people, especially people of his own voter base, who are strongly opposed to the THAAD missile defense being dispatched in South Korea. There were massive protests across the country, and especially in the area they were going to bring the missiles in. And the president himself flip-flopped quite a lot on the issue, and until he finally had to do it because the U.S. and ROK alliance is essential. It's strategic for any South Korean president.
All right. Among the delegations, by the way, coming from the north, it's not just athletes. Note the presence of Hyun Song-wol. She's the lead singer of the Moranbong Band, an orchestra handpicked by Kim Jong-un, whose vocalists wear short skirts or military uniforms. They dance and usually sing odes to Kim Jong-un. That's a clip from a song called With Pride. Catchy tune, Yana Lee?
It sounds like it, yes.
What do you think? Because how would that rank on the K-pop charts in the South?
It's not as modern or contemporary as some of the South Korean music stars would do it, I guess. It's a little bit 70s for South Koreans, I think.
You were saying about the different terminology when it came to ice hockey. This music is definitely from another era.
Yes.
Your thoughts, Nathan Park, on the fact that Kim Jong-un sending this band orchestra to the South. Why did that matter so much?
It mattered. I think the importance of it actually, I think ultimately it doesn't matter that much, and the importance of it was overblown. There was all these talks about how North Korea is using its propaganda campaign, it's engaging in this charm offensive. But the fact of the matter is, as it was just correctly pointed out, that music is not going to charm any South Korean. It's dated, and it's a curiosity, but it is not going. No one's going to have it on their Spotify playlist. So I think it's overblown. I think there's a dramatic example of that is that recently, just a few months ago, a North Korean soldier defected to South Korea by very bravely running across the DMZ and being shot. And after he came to in the hospital, one of the first things that he wanted to do is listen to a South Korean girl band music. Now, not only is there no South Koreans defecting into North Korea, I can hardly think of any South Korean who wanted to defect into North Korea to watch or listen to the Moranbong Band.
But what's interesting also about this story, Nathan, is that Kim Jong-un is reportedly a big sports fan. Every day we hear him, and we heard at the outset that clip where he denounced the West, he denounces the outside world. But he kind of wants to be a part of the culture, of the entertainment culture. It sounds like that everyone else has.
Right. He was educated in Switzerland. He was known to be a big Chicago Bulls fan, and he even invited Dennis Rodman several times. And I think it is more of a sort of a dictator's fancy to be seen as a respectable member of the international community. And there is definitely an opening to be exploited based on that. In a country like North Korea, whichever opening you see, you take it. On the other hand, it probably is a little overly optimistic to try and see if that will lead to any sort of less repression or less authoritarianism on Kim Jong-un's part.
Well, I guess it broaches the question of just how much has North Korea opened up.
Right, and when you look at those Masignon ski resort, the ski resort was a very ambitious project by Kim Jong-un, who again grew up in Switzerland and grew up admiring the ski resorts in the Alps. So it has all the outward trappings of a modern ski resort. But when, for example, Lester Holt of NBC went to broadcast from Masignon Ski Resort, you could notice that all the skiers were wearing the same clothes, probably rented or received from the same same distribution agency.
Harry Kazianis, your thoughts on how to engage with North Korea in light of the discussion we're having about what are the aspirations when it comes to sports and entertainment?
Well, I think the Trump administration has the right approach thus far. I mean, it's been a little disorientating, but I think on balance that, having a firm hand, in one respect, making sure sanctions are enforced, making sure countries like China and Russia enforce those sanctions, I think that's important. I think there is an element where the Trump administration would at some point like to talk to the North Koreans. I think what they're looking for is an extended period of time where they're not testing missiles and nuclear weapons, and it's not because of an Olympics thaw. As to the whole propaganda value that the North Koreans are pushing out, look, I do think there is, a value to them doing this. Because think about it, right now, we're not talking that extensively in the media about North Korea's ICBM capabilities or nuclear weapons or chemical weapons or biological weapons. We're talking about the length of North Korean singers' skirts and their music. That is a small victory for the North Koreans. I mean, it's smart marketing and smart marketing strategies. They're sending as a lead negotiator a few weeks ago the woman we were referring to, this K-pop person. So the North Koreans are getting some value out of this because it drops the temperature on the peninsula. We're talking about these third or fourth tier issues. We're not talking about the size of their ICBMs and missiles. That's important, and we need to recognize that.
Yeah, the South Korean president's popularity, we talked about in part one of our discussion, has slipped in the run-up to the games. It's still 60%, though, robust numbers when compared to how South Koreans view U.S. leadership. Donald Trump, as we were saying earlier, commander-in-chief to nearly 38,000 troops in South Korea. And those numbers have slumped both in South Korea and in Japan, which also relies on U.S. defense capability for its national security. Harry Kazianis, these Olympic Games, could Trump change that in any way during these games?
Well, I think there is some things the Trump administration can do to enhance its North Korea policy and overall Asia policy. First thing, the United States needs to appoint an ambassador to South Korea. We cannot have, controversies here in Washington that move over to South Korea about, different fights on who the ambassador should be. There's an outstanding individual named Victor Cha, who is all over the press here in Washington and globally, who would have been a great pick, who's one of the greatest North Korea scholars I know. I mean, a lot of grad students, when they study North Korea, have to read his book, The Impossible State. He's invited to speak all over the world. He's been misportrayed as a hawk. He's actually not a hawk. He's for engaging with the North Koreans. But because I guess he wouldn't endorse the idea of maybe a bloody nose, there's a lot of controversy about what actually happened. He was not picked. That is one of the things that needs to get fixed. If you don't have an ambassador in Seoul who is sort of Trump's point man that Seoul can trust, that's a huge problem. So one thing the Trump administration could do is they could actually announce their pick during the games of who the ambassador would be. And I think that would send a very powerful signal.
Yaneli, the Olympics are under the auspices of the International Olympic Committee, an organization that's based in Lausanne, Switzerland. It's supposed to be this international organization, even if it's privately run. In the eyes of many, especially in this country where they're furious that to please NBC television, they've moved the figure skating to the middle of the night. It caters to Americans. Do South Koreans have that view sometimes, that the Olympics are an American event coming to their peninsula?
I think a lot of countries might have this view, but then again, this time round, a lot of Korean media are trying to focus on the fact that this is our peace Olympics, as the Moon Jae-In administration likes to say. A lot of mainstream media trying to stand by our athletes, as every country does ahead of any big sporting event. They really want to make the event successful. And so far, regardless of what happens with the whole North Korean issue, so far it's been a success. There hasn't been major hurdles. North Korea is participating. They're already there. We're just waiting for a couple more senior officials to arrive, and it's been more or less smooth. So it's already been quite a success.
Nathan Park, when you think back to those 1988 Seoul Summer Olympics and you look at what was about to unfold over the next fortnight, what will it say about South Korea?
I think it'll be a very useful exercise to compare how South Korea reacted to 1988 games versus the 2018 games, 30 years apart. 1988 games was also a very a precarious event where Cold War was raging. Shortly before the Olympics, North Korean terrorists blew up a South Korean plane in an attempt to make the Olympics seem more dangerous. But the '88 Olympics pressed on, and it is generally considered successful. This time around, if the Pyeongchang Olympics end up becoming a turning point for the inter-Korean relations, it'll be a very important moment. Just to briefly touch upon the Victor Cha point earlier, I think one thing the U.S. really could do, I 100% agree with that. U.S. could do a lot more, and in fact, I would go a step farther and say that it's the United States that is not helping the matters at this point with this constant leak of whispers of bloody nose strike against North Korea or any kind of preemptive strike, and that is really causing greater tension on the U.S.-South Korea alliance over anything that South Korea or the Moon Jae-In administration is doing. Yeah,
because earlier in the conversation, Nathan, you heard Harry spell out all the different spheres within the Trump administration that have a little bit of a hand in the whole Korea issue. It must be interesting times for you in Washington these days.
It is. The fact that Victor Cha, the renowned North Korean scholar, who is respected across the board truly, the fact that he was not appointed as an ambassador came as a shock. The fact that within just hours of the fact that the news broke that he wasn't going to be appointed, Victor Cha penned an op-ed on the Washington Post opposing a bloody nose strike against North Korea, basically signaling that the administration was considering it. All that came as quite a bit of shock to Korea observers. So, now we are in this moment where the Olympics are just hours away, and there will be a truce and peace for the next 2 weeks or so. But the United States and the Trump administration could do very well by stepping off that. They can go ahead and talk about sanctions and being tough on North Korea, but they really should be willing to take off the military option off the table.
Nathan Park, I want to thank you for joining us from Washington. I also want to thank Harry Kazianis for being with us in the U.S. Capitol. Yenna Lee, stay with us. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to James Creedon.
Hi, Francois. Relying heavily on the English language Korean media today, I'll show you some of the headlines that we've come across. Moon will meet Kim Yo-jong on Saturday. That's the story that the Korea Times is going with on the top of its front page and on the website, and of course a lot of interest in the political aspect of the games in the Korean media, and that's of course the ICBM shown at the North Korea military parade. That is at the front and centre of
So wait a minute, with the time zone, is this Thursday's paper or Friday's paper?
Gosh, good point. They might be. That's Friday.
Oh, it is Friday.
It is
there
Friday.
You go.
Well,
there you go.
Maybe they have yet to update, but it looks.
No.
It looks like they're on top of their stuff.
Okay.
Now, of course, many media focusing on what was termed a huge military parade in North Korea as Vice President Mike Pence arrives in South Korea. That's NBC. But actually, interesting to note that the Jonggang Daily, is that correctly pronounced?
Jonggang.
Is playing down actually the size of that parade. Well, in any case, they're saying that while North Korea held a military parade on the eve of the Pyeongchang Winter Games, South Korean military officials thought the regime made efforts to keep it low-key, and no new weapons were rolled out. The North didn't give prior notice of the event in the state-run media, so it was sort of everybody was taken a little bit by surprise. Foreign media weren't allowed in, but there is a sense in Seoul that it was sort of kept relatively low key. I suppose it's all relative, isn't it? Because it's usually quite ostentatious, I guess.
We were looking at some of those South Korean papers. Here in France, sometimes the papers run like 32 pages.
Yeah.
There it's like 160, and it's full of ads. Times are booming for newspaper people.
They are indeed.
It's how polarized is the press in South Korea?
It's super polarized. The conservatives will say it can tell a completely different story than the progressives.
Right, well, their insights I couldn't particularly glean, but certainly I suppose sports should be the unifier, and the sports pages should usually be relatively politically free, but really a lot of the comment around this has been focusing on the geopolitics and the geostrategy. South Korea's president will host North Korean officials, including the First Sister. Big questions about whether Mike Pence will meet her, probably not. A couple of cartoons. This is from a French cartoonist. Are these the North Korean pom-pom girls? You know, this is the usual kind of derision that you're going to get in the Western media and the Western cartoons of sort of I suppose the uniforms and haircuts and whatnot. Rocket Man making an appearance in Chabat's cartoon from February 9th. Winter Olympics open in Pyeongchang, South Korea. There you go. What would you say? Skis with a bit of rocket fuel involved. And I think this is one that a lot of people will agree with, especially when it's coming from an account titled World Peace 2050. Hopefully we'll get there before 2050. The Little Olympic Ceremony curtain raiser military parade in Pyongyang has just come to an end. Streets empty quickly. And then North and South Koreans far more interested in watching the games. A new narrative for the peninsula is unfolding. Antonio Guterres tweeting as well, who was touring the Olympic Village. I was moved to see people from different cultures, different religions, different ways of life, all ready to compete in the Olympic spirit. We could use more of that spirit of solidarity and mutual respect all over the world. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge. Now, I'll just finish with one slightly lighter, completely apolitical note, which made me think of my efforts at assembling this little segment. The chef for the Norwegian Olympics team made a mistake on Google Translate when he was ordering food for and he ordered 15,000 eggs by mistake. I suppose lots of omelettes then, which was probably not a bad.
And a terrible pun.
A terrible pun. Well, it gets worse. Hold on. Extremely funny. That's
extremely funny.
But wait for it. The Independent speak of officials were left in shell shock by an extreme turn of events which left their culinary plans scrambled. There you go. So hopefully that'll be the end of their scrambled.
One chef's woes
efforts.
is a copy editor's delight.
Right.
Many thanks, James Creedon. I want to thank you. Our panel, thank you for joining us here in this pre-Olympic France 24 debate.